My general message to my British friends who are listening is, I have some bad news for you. You're not that important. This is a much bigger game. The United Kingdom is utterly irrelevant when it comes to the grander scheme of things. Here you have a major game of chess between the United States, the European Union, and China. That's why I believe that Europe is simply the stupid continent full of clever people that we are going to become utterly irrelevant.
Someone in this conversation needs to have a more optimistic note about Europe.
Wolfgang, you take this. I don't have the to do it.
The EU has no plan. The EU has no plan to deal with Trump. The EU has no plan to deal with China. Why should I be hopeful?
Hello and welcome to UnHerd. Trading relationships between different countries are not normally of great political interest. Stuff like the balance of trade, import duties are normally topics that only economists get excited about, and perhaps not even many of them. Not anymore. It seems suddenly like the whole world is having to retrain as some kind of armchair economist or trade observer these days, as these are the stuff of the biggest political moments. In just the past 10 days, we've had two apparent striking rebuttals of parties of the political right in Australia and in Canada. And in both cases, the questions of tariffs and the behavior of the Trump administration seem to have been key. We've had something of a populist surge here in the UK as the Reform UK party has done extremely well in local elections. And just in the past 24 hours, we've had the announcement of a trade deal between the US and the UK. We're just trying to get to grips with exactly how extensive that really is. But that itself comes 2 days after a trade deal with India, which caused bizarre amounts of political heat here in the UK. Suddenly, international trade is what everybody is talking about. And so I'm delighted to say we are joined by two of our absolute favourites here at UnHerd. We have Yanis Varoufakis joining us from Athens, and Wolfgang Münchau, another UnHerd columnist who is joining, I believe, from France on this occasion, but as you will know, is an expert on all matters European. Welcome to you both.
Welcome.
Great.
Thank you.
The deal between the US and the UK, we're going to start with that and we're going to broaden beyond it. Do either of you have a sense of whether it is actually a free trade deal, what kind of arrangement it is, and what we should make of it?
I don't think this will be a fundamental rearrangement in the trading relationships between the US and the UK, but it will have a lot of consequences. We should not underestimate its importance. I mean, it will certainly make life between the UK and the EU very interesting. And I think the EU will probably not get a trade deal with the United States, or not so easily, and it will be harder. The EU is already preparing counter sanctions, so the mood in Brussels is not great right now. If the UK has a trade deal with the US and the EU does not have a trade deal with the US, then the question is, can the EU and the UK have a trade deal with one another? In the long run, that will be a question, whether you can have zero tariffs between the UK and the EU, but not zero and different trading regimes between either of them and a third country, especially such a big country. And eventually, the UK always try to have it both ways. It's the classic UK position, but this might be difficult. And I was wondering, for the UK just to do this without any consultation with the EU, it's an interesting proposition, interesting experiment, and we'll see.
As Wolfgang said, this deal is going to make Keir Starmer's attempt to edge back towards the single market of the European Union, to strike a deal with the European Union, impossible. It is as if Trump shows some political prowess by driving a wedge between the European Union and the United Kingdom. We know how much he hates the European Union. We know how much he supports Farage and Brexit. And in a way, this deal solidifies Brexit for the ages, if it goes ahead. When it comes to the nitty-gritty of it, my understanding is that Britain is going to get a buy regarding aluminium and car exports to the United States. It will be a reduction of that 25% tariff. Keir Starmer is going to present this as a victory, and it will be a victory of sorts. On the other hand, he was going to have to give something back, something that is still great skin of his nose, something like the digital tax, the cloud tax, as I call it, which costs the American Silicon Valley big tech something like 500 million maximum a year. But he had already promised to the OECD that he was going to do away with this tax if the deal that imposes a minimum tax to multinational corporations that was struck at the level of the OECD goes ahead. But my general message to my British friends who are listening is, I have some bad news for you. You're not that important. This is a much bigger game. The United Kingdom is utterly irrelevant when it comes to the grander scheme of things. Here you have a major game of chess between the United States, the European Union, and China. These are the three main players. The India Britain deal, the US-UK deal, they are tiny little pipsqueaks of deals in this grander scheme of things. And the interests of the people of Britain are going to be determined. Your prospects will not be determined by these small deals. They will be determined by how this larger geopolitical, geoeconomic chess game is being played.
I think that's where we need to get into, Yanis, very soon. I want to ask one more question, if I could, because at risk of scooping ourselves, we've actually conducted an interview earlier this afternoon, just an hour ago, with the United States Trade Representative, Mr. Jameson Greer. This is another UnHerd exclusive. And one of the questions he was asked was about Brexit. And he said, quote, well, Brexit made it possible for the UK to do this, especially with respect to tariff levels, but also Brexit liberates them to work with us in meaningful ways on non-tariff barriers. So we were discussing there the politics between the UK and the EU. They are not going to be very delighted to hear the US Trade Representative talk so warmly about Brexit. Yanis, do you have any reaction to that? You were definitely against Brexit when it happened. Do you think we can count this as a Brexit win?
In a sense, yes. In a small sense, because there is no doubt that Trump is going to support Brexit, and he's already been doing it, by giving the United Kingdom something less worse than what he's giving the European Union. And, Brexiteers are going to celebrate. Keir Starmer is going to swallow it because he won't be able not to use it as, some point-scoring exercise on his behalf. But at the same time, it is undermining his own longer-term project, which is to come closer to the European Union.
Wolfgang, what do you think about that? Is this a Brexit win?
Oh, definitely a Brexit win. I mean, if you want to call this a win, yes. I mean, definitely it will cement Brexit. That is for sure. And I mean, everything the Trump administration does, they're quite consistent. I mean, people will poke fun at him and all these announcements, but in Germany he's supporting the AfD. This is the party that wants to leave the EU. They're not just slightly Eurosceptic. They actually want out. And he has been supportive of Russia and the Ukraine talks. He has been. You see what he did to Ukraine, and he's playing it sort of both sides now. He's playing sort of the arbiter in between. He's not on the side of the Europeans, and the Europeans understand that now. They didn't for a long time, but there is now clarity that Trump is not on their side, and they are kind of preparing for the worst, even though they are ill-prepared for the situation at this point, because their entire economic system, their trading system, their whole sort of economic policy is all geared towards America buying European goods. And Germany just had a new government installed this week, and the economics minister, the first thing she said was, well, my priority is to increase exports. And I say, good luck to her. I mean, increase exports with Trump. You need to have somebody to absorb your exports. China stopped doing this. The UK kind of stopped doing this after Brexit. Now it's the US that stops doing it. Who else is going to buy your exports? Should you not be talking about a new economic model and think differently? So the EU will be, I think, much, much harder hit than the UK, because the UK is a small, flexible economy. It doesn't matter. I agree with Yanis. It doesn't matter in a grand scheme of things. I think this deal is, from a global trading point of view, irrelevant. But the UK, will probably be okay. I don't think that the UK will suffer greatly as a result of Trump's policies. The US will probably be okay as well after some initial hiccup. The EU, I don't think the EU will be okay.
Yanis, do you share that? I'm going to throw one more quote at you from our interview earlier this afternoon. Asked about the Europeans, he says, I would say they have philosophical, legal and cultural aversion to what we're doing, it will be very challenging. I mean, this is from the guy who is in charge of US trade policy. Doesn't sound like very kind of positive grounds for deals with Europe.
The situation regarding the European Union has been heading that way, independently of this gentleman that you interviewed, independently of even the great Donald himself. We have predicated the whole growth and development project of the European Union on having the macroeconomic environment being guaranteed and nurtured by Washington, D.C. since 1950. The first 2 decades after the establishment of the first European community in 1950, remember, we were part of the dollar zone. We had a United States which was exporting its surpluses to Europe through the Marshall Aid Plan, through credits, through various ways. They were dollarizing Europe in order to ensure that we were buying their net exports. That period was a period of the great economic miracle of Germany, which was predicated on the fact that it had guaranteed markets, essentially, and they were guaranteed by the United States. And then this system, the Bretton Woods system, the first 2 decades after 1950, are totally blown out of the water by the Americans themselves when they lost their surpluses. And then you had the next 5 decades, what is called as, referred to as globalization, where exactly the opposite sort of recycling of surpluses happens. It is now Germany and Japan in Asia and later China, but from the European perspective, it is Germany that is the net exporter to the United States. It is the Eurozone as a whole which has been Germanized as a result of very, very clear policies to Germanize the Eurozone. And essentially, we have subcontracted the demand for European products to the United States trade deficit. At some point, some American president would say enough. And it happened to be Donald Trump in his first incarnation, 1.0. But then remember, when Biden comes in, who was meant to be the anti-Trump, he was going to supposedly do exactly the opposite of Trump, but he loved the Europeans. He didn't have this inimical relationship with the Europeans, as Wolfgang said, that Trump has. But nevertheless, through his IRA policy, his industrial policy, the whole point was to attract German capital to the United States, to steal it effectively from Europe, to create new barriers. Essentially, Trumpism was adopted to a large extent by Biden, and then Trump 2.0 comes and turbocharges it. We have only ourselves to blame in the European Union for creating an economy that needed to, as I said before, subcontract demand to the United States of America. Effectively, we became utterly dependent on the United States of America in the same way we became dependent on the cheap gas of Gazprom and Vladimir Putin.
This is going to be really bad for the. I mean, I completely agree with the history that Yanis just outlined. The big mistake the Europeans are making now is they think this is a phase. This is going to go. Oh, we can fight the guy, because since all the experts hate him. And so certainly in Europe, all the experts hate him. That I can assure you of. There isn't, I don't know of a single economist or even political scientist or journalist or commentator who actually supports Trump. And that's really sort of changed. But the trying to fight the guy is going to be very, very difficult for Europe and very counterproductive. So I think this is going to be we're going to see a titanic battle between the EU and the United States. And my hunch is at this point is that there will not be a trade deal between the US and the EU, but maybe not a trade war. I think the Europeans would probably be smart enough not to retaliate, because that would be counterproductive if you run surplus. So I think the EU will be a higher tariff zone than the UK.
Is that you call it a titanic battle, and we all remember how that ended. If deficits are bad, trade deficits, and that the voters, both in Europe and in the United States, are unhappy because of them, or at least in the UK that you were mentioning, is it a zero-sum battle? That basically one bloc needs to win and one needs to lose? Or is there a world in which they're both happy?
No, I mean, there may have been a brief time, but they were how possible. But that's me. The problem isn't trade deficits. I have nothing against trade deficits and trade surplus. When people trade, there, people have deficits. The Europeans have structural surpluses. They have them every year. Germany has a structural surplus between 6 and 8% of the entire economy. And if Germany doesn't have a structural surplus, Germany is in deep recession. Germany cannot exist without the surplus. This is what I call mercantilism. This is nothing else. You have to have a surplus, and that means someone else will have to have a deficit. And otherwise, you can't breathe. That's the structure. So the fact that Germany had a surplus in 1 year, who cares? But this is not the situation. And the fact that the UK has these. But what happened if you have a deficit? You import other people's goods, you deindustrialize. And then, the city of London does well, and certain industries that are based in London do extremely well, and the industrial zones do not well. So you get a distributional problem. It's not a problem of GDP. UK GDP is not particularly dramatically bad. It's not different from, say, German GDP or French GDP. It's not you won't see it in those numbers. You'll see it in the sort of distribution of income. You see it in, how happy people are in places where industrial cities.
But Yanis, do you agree then? Who wins in this titanic battle?
Well, you see, it's only a zero-sum game. If everybody tries to be a net exporter, a mercantilist, as Wolfgang put it. To lighten the discussion a bit, if I may, I will never forget the conversation I was having with my counterpart in 2015. You will remember the gentleman, Wolfgang Schäuble. It was a light-hearted discussion. It was outside the context of the tough negotiations. We were having a little bit of a banter between us. And I said to him that I heard from somewhere that he was a great admirer of the hugely important German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And I reminded him of the Kantian categorical imperative. The idea that a rule, because you remember, rules were very big in the lexicon of the German government, in particular of Wolfgang Schäuble. Rules, they must be respected. And I was saying to him, well, Kant has taught us that a rule is only rational if it can be applied by everyone in a manner which is logically coherent. But if everybody applies your rules, because he was saying to me, what you need to do, you would need to Germanize Greece, you have to become net exporters too. And I said to him, another Wolfgang, I said, Wolfgang, according to Kant, this can't be rational, because if we all do that, then we must believe in extraterrestrials who are interested in purchasing our stuff. Because if every country or economic bloc in the world has a surplus, and is a net exporter, there must be extraterrestrials that will have to purchase. He wasn't very amused by this. But the serious point I'm trying to make is that if you have this mentality, whether you are the Chinese government or the German government or the Japanese government, and you think that this is the model, then you will have to accept that others will have deficits. You cannot celebrate your own surpluses and at the same time disparage others for being in deficit, which is the situation we were finding as Greeks in at the time. So to answer your question, no. We can have a win-win situation. We can have mutual advantage. This is the whole point about trading. Trading is mutually advantageous as long as you don't have the structural imbalances. People say to me from both China and Germany, but Mr. Varoufakis, why are you against us exporting? I said, I'm not against you exporting. You can export, the more the better. But then you will have to balance your trade books by importing more if you export more. Because if you don't, then essentially you're condemning your own people to austerity, and you are condemning your own industry to long-term deindustrialization through very low investment. Because, we macroeconomists know very few things. This is the only thing we know for absolutely certain, because it's not even a theorem, it's an axiom.
What I see in Europe is everyone doubling down with the same old story. They're still doing the same thing that they did in the Euro crisis. They're doing the same thing all over. They say we need to export more. Where if you basically have no more people out in the world who want to buy your stuff, you may want to say, okay, maybe this strategy isn't going to work anymore. We need to do something different. But I think this is sort of the thing, and I think there's sort of a political equivalent to that as well. Everybody, virtually every columnist in the British media and the American media, they kind of lived in the age of globalization. And everybody kind of got used to its parameters. It's very difficult for people to say this isn't working anymore. This is the system. All the assumptions we have made that freedom of movement is a good thing, trade is a good thing, freedom of capital is a good thing. People didn't question that, or that America supports Europe in defense, and that we relied on the United States. People question, and people get angry at the United States for no longer wanting to do that. And people go to the extreme that they start to criticize voters, and in the way that was famously done by Hillary Clinton. But I would never criticize voters for voting for anything, because in Europe we started to ban political parties. The Romanians are banning that. We used to, and Yanis will probably talk about the pressure that the European establishment put on his government back in 2015, and now it's the right. We're banning the right in Romania. We're banning Marine Le Pen. The Germans are considering whether they should ban the AfD, because the minute anyone goes against the systems, not that the AfD knows anything about economics, and their economics is probably as bad, and probably worse even. But the point is that everybody is so much in the system that they don't see that the system is failing. So I think we're seeing sort of a classic, you can't step outside problem, because this has been going on for a long time. The system has been, the globalization system is as old as the oldest one.
So it sounds like both of you are, in a way, supportive of what Donald Trump is trying to do, because he would also frame himself as challenging the system, this decades-long globalization that has hollowed out the middle class and deindustrialized.
There's a crucial distinction to be made here, Freddie. Sorry for butting in. There is no doubt that Trump is asking the right question. He has put his finger on the right problem. That's one thing. That I support. But I don't support his policies. The way in which he's trying to fix it. Okay. And by the way, those liberals, centrists, center-leftists, center-rightists, who are lamenting the fact that this is unprecedented. All this stuff that's coming from Washington, D.C. has never happened before. This is what I've tried to argue in my UnHerd columns. This is completely untrue. Take, for instance, one example. One person, one central banker, Paul Volcker, that everybody waxes lyrical about. The whole of this centrist establishment considers him to be a great man. I don't agree, I don't disagree, it doesn't matter. But here I've got a quotation from something he wrote in the Washington Post in 2005. And I have to read it, Freddie, I hope you bear with me. He says, "What holds the United States economic miracle altogether is a massive and growing flow of capital from abroad, running to more than 2 billion every working day and growing. As a nation," that's the Americans, "as a nation, we don't consciously borrow or beg. We are not even offering attractive interest rates, nor do we have to offer our creditors protection against the risk of a declining dollar. We fill our shops and our garages with goods from abroad, and the competition has been a powerful restraint on our internal prices. It has surely helped keep interest rates exceptionally low, despite our vanishing savings and rapid growth. And it's comfortable for our trading partners and our allies," he means the Europeans, "and those supplying the capital. Some, such as China and Europe, depend heavily on our expanding domestic markets. And for the most part, the central banks of the emerging world have been willing to hold more and more dollars, which are, after all, the closest thing the world has to a truly international currency. The difficulty," this is 2005, "is that this seemingly comfortable pattern can't go on indefinitely." That sounds very much like somebody from the Trump administration would have said, something I would have said, something Wolfgang would have said. That does not mean that the Trumpian playbook of hitting everyone with gigantic tariffs and then having these one-on-one negotiations is going to put the financialization genie back into the bottle, which is essential in order to rebalance the world.
Yeah. I would add to this. Trump plays on these bilateral trades, like he did with the UK. That's kind of the wrong way to go about this. I would have used the dollar. I just heard BMW today complain that the euro appreciated like 10%, and they're already screaming. And that's if you wanted to really get at the Europeans, a 30% dollar devaluation would really do more than a tariff. It would kind of do the job. If you wanted to rebalance the world, obviously the US would also have to start incurring a lower budget deficit. This is part of the imbalances. It's not just us It's not just the mercantilists, the bad Europeans. It's, the US has played along, as Volker was saying. I mean, he's essentially describing a Ponzi game. A Ponzi game that worked, and it worked for years. These things can go on for a long time until, as he rightly predicted, they don't. And they usually, you can't predict why they don't go. And they could hit some financial crisis. In this case, it was a political problem because people didn't support this anymore. So that's the fact. That's the reality of the situation. People don't want this anymore. So we're in this sort of situation where this Ponzi game, that sort of wonderful balance where everybody agreed to interact with one another is over now. What I would have advised Trump to do, and he has a lot of advisors around him who disagree amongst each other. There was Scott Bessent, who was the Treasury Secretary, who was not a fan of tariffs. He talked about tariffs as the gun on the table, as Americans would always, use this martial language. The gun on the table. This was not intended to be fired. It was certainly not intended to be the first thing to do. But in the end, Trump decided to go with tariffs. And now they are trying to rescue the policy. I think the tariffs will happen almost in the way that Trump announced them on April the 2nd. I would not hope for big retreats. He will cut some deals and he will make a lot of it, some political point scoring. But China and Europe will have big tariffs. I would expect the 25 car tariff to stay, so Europeans will not be able to sell their cars to the United States. More than 25% tariffs is kind of stupid and counterproductive because people stop trading. You don't collect any tariffs. There comes a point, I think the 45% tariffs on China is just completely ridiculous. It's just an embargo, basically. Who's going to buy anything at like 3 times the price? So this is just, if he wants to collect the money, this would actually contribute to the reduction in the deficit. I think they'll have to raise taxes. I think Trump wants to decrease taxes. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy about this. So we're not, I'm not supporting, what's happening. I completely agree that, a lot of economists have this issue, who sort of like us, who think that Trump is onto something. Now, I have to say he's onto something. And, the difficulty I have, and I can't say I support this because this is not how I would do this. This is how I would not advocate anyone. And I'm so glad I'm not in, I'm not in the administration where I have to kind of feel, be conflicted about this, because I think quite a lot of people will be conflicted about this. But could the alternative have prevailed? No, I don't think so.
So what's so interesting is that you both, coming from very different political positions, you both acknowledge that Trump has his finger over the button of a key problem, or at least he's identified a key problem, and that the old world order has kind of expired in any case, so something else is going to replace it. What I haven't heard yet is what should replace it, if not this kind of tariff on-off chaos that we've had at the moment. Yanis, do you want to have a go there? I mean, what would you like to? What should he have done?
Look, I've been talking about this now for decades. I've written books about it. So thank you for the opportunity to plug my idea, which is not my idea, by the way. Look, if we want to rebalance the world economy and to do it in a manner which is sustainable, then to begin with, in order to undo the structural imbalances, as Wolfgang put it, you need a world trading system and a world monetary accounting system which penalizes symmetrically the large deficits, structural deficits, and the large structural surpluses. It has to be done symmetrically, unlike the European Union, for instance, where you only penalize the deficits, whereas the surpluses are fine. How can this be done? Well, there was a gentleman called John Maynard Keynes who, during the Bretton Woods Conference in April 1944 in New Hampshire, he outlined precisely how this should be done. It was so beautifully put that he got a huge round of applause, and the representative of the United States in that conference, Harry Dexter White, the representative of FDR at the time, congratulated him wholeheartedly for the beautiful idea, which then he proceeded utterly to reject. Because the whole idea behind the balanced and balancing system that he was proposing, he called it the International Clearing Union, the idea was to have, to denominate all trade and capital flows in a common accounting unit, not a common currency, but a common accounting unit, and to have a levy being imposed on countries that exceed a certain level, either in terms of their deficit or in terms of their surplus. In order to rebalance the system, those levies accumulate in a bank account that he had imagined would be stored in or kept with the World Bank. And those monies would then be invested in the deficit areas in the developing countries. Today we could say, green investments in green energy in Africa, whatever, in order to rebalance the world. The idea is there. I think that it has stood the test of time in terms of its theoretical and intellectual coherence. But what has come in the way is that Harry Dexter White, representing the United States at the time, the only creditor nation, the only superpower to be standing after the horrors of the Second World War. By the way, happy V Day to all of us in Europe today. The problem was that they were not going to allow any other accounting unit except the dollar. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar was a source of immense political power, and the Americans would not give it away. Today, however, they know that the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is an albatross around their neck too. There are people in the Trump administration who understand that. Trump himself clearly doesn't. But whether they understand it or not, I think that this discussion we've been having about the European Union and a titanic battle with the United States, Wolfgang, on this I don't agree. Essentially what will happen is the European Union will be bypassed, will be left behind, it will be left on the side. The major game now is between the United States and China. And I very much suspect that the Chinese are slowly, gradually, but surely moving to a model very similar to what Keynes presented in the Bretton Woods Conference for the BRICS Plus area, to rebalance at least their part. And this is something that Trump could live with as long as he has the rest of the world, the Western Hemisphere as he call it, to call it his own. This is not a good outcome, but if you ask me what I think is going to transpire in the end, I think we're moving in that direction.
I think we have to move on to China, but just before I let Wolfgang respond, can I just interject with a non-professional economist reaction to what Yanis just said, an intuitive political reaction, which is an expanded role for the World Bank, some kind of, to my ears, somewhat socialist-sounding redistributive bureaucracy that took money from one place and gave it to another, sounds, and I suspect would sound to people who voted for Donald Trump, like replacing one bad system with another. It's precisely that kind of international institution they want rid of. They want less kind of people above the nation state taking power. They want liberation. They want to be able to sell whatever they like and buy whatever they like.
Well, their notion of freedom is my notion of slavery. But look, Freddie, just before Wolfgang comes in, this is why I'm saying that Trump's identification of the problem is something I'm sympathetic to. But the way he has educated or ill-educated the MAGA movement is a clear and present danger for the interests of humanity, because they will reject anything that resembles a solution to all these imbalances, solvent of these imbalances, a solvent of these sources of massive economic hardship for their world. They will reject all of them wholeheartedly. That is the reason why I consider myself to be a political enemy of Donald Trump and his MAGA movement.
Wolfgang?
I think I want to take a step back to this and look at this politically rather than economically. There is another theory from a political economist, Danny Roderick, who has come up with this what he called an impossible trilemma. That what is inconsistent is, hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democracy. And I think that's what that's what the problem was in 1944, when Keynes' idea was rejected. It was the problem. With any of these sort of cooperative solutions, is that the U.S. has just imposed its national sovereignty over globalization. That's just happened. So if you have democracy, and I think we probably agree that this is not up up for negotiation. Maybe in the EU, maybe in parts of the world, maybe in where people are starting to ban political parties. I feel very strongly about this. I think this is a mistake. But generally, we are not abandoning democracy. Countries have refused to abandon sovereignty. This has been the reason why the European integration has failed, because people have, member states have insisted on retaining national sovereignty, yet they founded the euro, which is a contradiction. And the euro is failing for the same reason of this impossible triangle. And either you do it, so this is hyperglobalization. This was a project of hyperglobalization. Think of globalization as a European version of globalization. It failed because we have basically just done one step, but then we kept all the power in member states, and democracies and voters did not support this any longer. And that is the fundamental reason why I don't think there can be a negotiated solution for as long as we accept national sovereignty. If you assume that we're all Democrats, then we have to basically say that national sovereignty and hyperglobalization have not only reached the limit, they've gone beyond the limit. So it's got to be a trade-off between the two. And this is where I would say, I'm not sort of saying what my preference is. I would probably prefer, I'm strongly in favor of European integration, but the democratic version of European integration, not the kind of decentralized version where the European Council takes decisions in private and without the consultation or without any input of parliamentarians or the public. That's not my idea of European integration. If that's the only version on offer, I would reject it. And as I'm beginning to become very, much more skeptical of the process that they have embarked on, not the idea of European integration, but the process that has been that has gone with the Treaty of Lisbon and is now sort of going further in that direction. I think the same happens in globalization. It's very hard to think of world government. I mean, we're not going to get that. So the fact is that if we insist on national sovereignty as we do, we will have to retreat, and this can fall out in different ways. The U.S., China, the duopoly in the world, it can splinter into many other parts. It could be the Brits. The European could form a coalition with the Canadians and some others. There are all sorts of coalitions possible in this thing. It could splinter into 3 or 4.
So Wolfgang, what I'm hearing then is, so instead of a kind of single solution for the world, what you're predicting, even though you're not necessarily endorsing it, is a kind of fragmentation into blocks and then potentially sub-blocks and sub-blocks of those ever smaller, and a genuine process of deglobalization. That's what you think will now happen?
I think so, because I think this is as long as we believe that the member states, that the nation state is the sovereign unit, and an age of where we have technological freedoms and where people can inform themselves freely, where we have less censorship through the media, where people can basically form their views in a way that wasn't the case before. In such a world where we have democracy, where people can basically have access to information that was denied to them in previous decades, in such a world it is not possible to maintain this form of globalization that we have in the past, and there will be other structures. And I'm not predicting necessarily that it will be 3 or 2. It could be any of them. It's very messy. Depends very much on how people react. I mean, you could think of the United States forming some coalition with Vietnam and South Korea and the UK and Japan and a couple of countries. You could think of the UK, the EU, and Canada forming a sort of multilateralist alliance. You could find China becoming the head of the BRICS. The BRICS got split into different things, depending very much on how China behaves in the BRICS. What Yanis says is one possibility, but it's not clear that they all. This is also not a coherent group. They agree that they want to be independent of the United States. They're introducing separate payment systems, and we will also see that another story maybe for another day is the role of the dollar, which is a very important part of the story, not a technical part. It's actually a very political part. But we all starting to think about with the United States no longer being sort of the guarantor of our things. Should we still use dollars to the extent that we do? And the BRICS countries, they have already concluded no, that they needed alternative systems. And there's a lot happening at the moment.
I was just going to say, ask Yanis whether, even though it's not what you would like to see, by the sounds of it, your beautiful John Maynard Keynes concept. If that's not happening, do you share Wolfgang's prediction, at least, that the multipolar / ever smaller bloc, a genuine process of deglobalization, is now the likely outcome?
As I said before, I think that China, whether it will be all the BRICS within it or not, is going to have a bloc within which most trading will take place on the basis of the renminbi, of the yuan, their digital systems, which are absolutely spick and span and hugely innovative. If you look at the way they are constructing their digital currency at the central bank, the BRICS Pay, it's state of the art. The Americans have nothing anywhere near that, simply because Wall Street will never allow the Fed to develop such capacities. And that is a major advantage that the Chinese have, that Wall Street and Silicon Valley are at loggerheads. Whereas in China, for political reasons that we're all familiar with, what I call cloud capital and finance have merged into one thing, and that gives them a capacity to create that space around the BRICS. I very much fear that the rest of the world is not going to be a bloc or blocks. It will come closer to the way in which Trump conceptualizes the ideal world from his rather problematic perspective. He sees the world, that's my understanding, I may be completely wrong, but I think that Trump sees the world as a bicycle wheel that has a hub in the center, and the hub is Trump or the United States. And everybody else is like a spoke. And every spoke has to connect with the hub, cannot talk to the other spokes. Even if a spoke breaks or three spokes break, the bicycle wheel still works. So I think that this is where we're moving, the possibility that the European Union is going to get its act together and that it will form an alliance with Canada. I really cannot see any of this. In the end, whether it's Carney or Australia, look at Australia. Everybody's celebrating the victory of Albanese, and I understand that. I'm saying this as a proud Australian citizen, by the way. But there is no doubt that Australia is the 51st state of the United States. When it comes to its defense policy, when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to... There is not one whim of Washington, D.C. since the late 1970s, which has not become law in a place like Australia. There's no way that Australia will spin out of the center of gravity of the bicycle wheel that Trump conceptualizes the world to be at. So I think that we're going to move in this direction, a bloc that will be very rationally structured. That doesn't mean that it will be a pleasant place to live in, and that will be the Chinese bloc, because they're extremely rational and very, very, very cautious. Have you seen recently, under Trump, how cautiously they move? Wolfgang mentioned the possibility, if you look at the macroeconomics, then of course Vietnam looks very close to the United States, but so does South Korea. But you have seen the recent moves by China to diplomatically establish very strong links with Vietnam and South Korea as a result of the Trump shock. So this is my prediction. My prediction is a solid Chinese-led bloc and the rest of the world resembling a bicycle wheel.
Forgive my trying to understand your analogy here. Are we talking about two bicycle wheels, Yanis? One with China at the center and one with the United States?
I think the Chinese are going to build it up in a multilateral fashion. To put it differently, I think that they will try to create something similar, not to the idea of Keynes, about the ICU, which I mentioned before, but something similar to what the Bretton Woods system was like. In fact, it was like. Remember, people say to me, but they haven't opened their capital account, they have capital controls. Well, we had capital controls at Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is a system of fixed exchange rates with almost fixed interest rates and capital controls and a lot of constraints on what the banks could do. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese are moving in that direction as the main bloc and then have satellites around them. So that wouldn't be spinning like a wheel. It will be a very solid system because remember, the Bretton Woods system, which was the golden age of capitalism, was a very, very strict, placid, and by the way, Freddie, it was the definition of central planning. You called it socialist. I wouldn't call it socialist, but it was centrally planned. Think about it. When I was born, the exchange rate between my country's currency and the dollar was exactly the same as it was when I was 16. It didn't fluctuate 1 cent, right? That was a planned system. So when they say that they want, the MAGA people, that they want to make America great again, they all hark back to the 50s and 60s. That is their mindset. They're not thinking of the 20s. They're thinking of the 50s and 60s, where the world economy was planned by Washington, D.C. with the same statist ruthlessness as Gosplan, the Ministry of Economic Planning, was planning the Soviet economy.
Wolfgang, do you share this vision? I mean, either way, I suppose, a stronger China is inevitable. Some form of bloc forming around it is obviously already taking place. How successful the United States is in slowing its own demise is, I guess, up for grabs. Where does Europe fit into this? I mean, is Europe the forgotten spoke? Are we the part of the Venn diagram that nobody cares about? Is it Hungary to the Chinese and then France to the Americans? Or how does it play out, do you think?
Probably something like that, the broken wheel that's just on the side of the street. Something like this, if you want to keep to this analogy. I'm more uncertain about. I'm very, I mean, I believe China will do it. I'm in awe of the Chinese technological development. I mean, they are, they've just what they've done. For example, they were predicted. I mean, there's Chris Miller's famous book on the chip wars book, and he was very negative about China's ability to develop semiconductors. Now, in the last 3 years, where we imposed sanctions on China. United States imposed, high semiconductor bans. It stops the Dutch company ASML from exporting its machines. But China, for some, for reasons not understood by the American administration, has now managed to build, 4 to 7 nanometer semiconductors all by itself. And the Chinese, we've trained them in our universities for decades now. China is not a company that imitates us any longer. They are leaders in electronics and AI. I've been working myself extensively on AI, and but Europe is nowhere in this. Absolutely nowhere in this. Not only in terms of the investment, but also in terms of academic research, in terms of the latest thinking, the latest papers, the latest developments. They're mostly Chinese and American and increasingly Chinese contributors to this. So China is a very serious country, but what they would need to do, and this is going to be very difficult for them. They're running they're running the world's largest trade surplus. They are very hooked on this. They are they're the Germany on steroids. I mean, Germany admires the Chinese because that's what they would like to be. I mean, an even bigger trade surplus. And the Chinese do it through very open repression, financial repression. You see this. If you're if you're a saver in Japan, and in China, you get very low interest rates. It's a very bad deal, and the Chinese are managing this process. And it's going to be very difficult for China to rebalance. It's most of the stimulus programs, including the recent ones, are very modest. The country has a very, very low ratio of spending to GDP. It's mostly exports. This is where the country resides. And if it's building up this sort of network of friendly countries, it can't just be the reason the EU can't do this because the euro is not the global currency because we keep running these surpluses. We would have to at least balance our books. If you run surpluses against the rest of the world has to buy your currency. You have to buy. You're investing in everyone's as currency. The flow goes out of your country, and in the UK and the United States, the flow goes into your country, and that is not that's the reason the dollar. So the deficit, the trade deficit in particular, and the role of the dollar are kind of interlinked.
Wolfgang, can I interject for a second? I agree entirely with what you're saying, except that the United States in 1950 created Bretton Woods, dollarized Europe and Japan in order to maintain their surplus. The idea is we are going to be the surplus country. We're going to be selling you the stuff. You are going to be net exports galore. And then our surpluses, our financial surpluses, we will recycle them into Europe and into Japan in the form of aid, of loans, state loans, private loans, and so on, so that you have the money to keep us in a net surplus. So the Chinese now, unlike the Europeans, have two very good options. Now, I'm not sure they've decided which one to take or whether they should take a mixture of it. One is to render BRICS into a Bretton Woods system where they remain the surplus country. Their currency, with capital controls and so on, is the anchor of the system, where they recycle. They've already done it with the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. They could be giving all the credits that are necessary to countries like Malaysia, Pakistan, and so on, and even to Russia, and then sell them the net exports. And this recycling system, that's one option they have. The other option they have, which I agree with you, because I suspect you will also think this is the better option, is to rebalance their own economy by essentially boosting aggregate demand, consumption within. But, I just said they have two options. What does Europe have? Unless we create a United States of Europe, if we created the United States of Europe, because you and I have been arguing now for yonks in favor of a safe asset, a Eurobond. But you can't have a Eurobond if you don't have a federal treasury. And you can't have a federal treasury as a Democrat and not have a proper federation, a democratic federation. And we had this opportunity in 2012, 2013. Merkel killed it, murdered it. And now we don't have it anymore because the politics has become so toxic that we will simply never have it. So we don't have options. And that's why I believe that Europe is simply the stupid continent full of clever people that we are going to become utterly irrelevant.
Someone in this conversation needs to have a more optimistic note about Europe. And I'm going to take that role for one. Okay, but let me throw this at you. Why might Europe not be quietly a beneficiary of the bipolar sort of willy-waving standoff between the two mighty powers of China and the United States? We have got used in recent decades to basically attaching ourselves to the US. Maybe we now begin to attach ourselves to the Chinese imperium as well as the US, and we remain the place with the beautiful cities, the place where people want to come, the provider of luxury goods to both empires, and kind of stay out of it.
Wolfgang, you take this. I don't have the will to do it.
Europe as a museum, there are certainly some jobs in that business model. I just don't think this will be one in which 500 million Europeans will be employed and will be happy. And generally, countries with very high degrees of tourism find in Europe, like France, find themselves often in difficulty because tourism is something it's not a great thing to be dependent on tourism.
Even manufacturing, like your German machines, German cars can be sold to the Chinese. It may well be.
No, they can't.
Why not?
Let's just put your example. They can't. The problem with the Europeans is that we're no longer where we were 20 years ago. The German cars 20 years ago. Germany had crises before. There's nothing new. But 20 years ago, the Volkswagen, whatever, Beetle or Golf or whatever, was the state-of-the-art car in its class. That's not the case anymore. The state-of-the-art car in its class is called BYD and has other names. It's nowadays it's mobile phone companies that produce cars. It's actually no longer a car. Actually, a car is a digital device with some wheels around it. The modern car, the electric car, it's a completely different product. Like the computer is different from the typewriter, and the Germans are not good at this, and the British are not good at this either. We decided in Europe not to invest in these technologies that the Chinese and the Americans invested in, and we felt this was something to do with who we are, and we thought we needed to have data protection. And we taxed all these digital services, and we imposing our rules on those digital services. We felt very confidently that we can swing this, and in the process of this, we fell behind. And nowhere is this clearer than in Germany, where it's a very Luddite country. I've just been to Germany. I could not hold a conversation in a train on my mobile phone. Very normal. The trains are usually late. People tweet. People write a tweet when the train arrives on time these days. Very different from what it used to be. The motorways are in disrepair, but the entire digital infrastructure is completely absent. Now they have a digitalization minister. They will probably, find a way to replace the fax machine, which, interestingly enough, still exists in Germany and is heavily used. But this is not going to be the country that will be at the forefront of artificial intelligence, especially given that it has an energy policy that does not provide enough cheap energy for this type of operation. So virtually all the parameters of business going in the wrong direction. So this is why we have this pessimism. It's not like we can sort of wiggle through this sort of global standoff between America and China and kind of trade with both people. It's going to find it difficult. If the Americans don't want to observe our surpluses, the Chinese, have basically no longer need our products. This is what happened. I mean, Germany used to export tons of stuff to China until China developed a capability and turned it around. China's become a structural net exporter to Germany. China's beaten Germany at its own game. And Germans have invested strongly in China. The relationship is very strong. And I think there will be, you will try to maintain and recalibrate its relationship with China. I believe they will. I absolutely agree.
Let me be kinder to Freddie's optimism and his, good spirits regarding the possibilities and the prospects of Europe. Look, there is no doubt that Europe could do things in its own interest. For instance, regarding China. I'm not saying that you should become subservient to China. You should remain critical. You should remain vigilant regarding a number of issues that we have open with China. But things that they could do, for instance, abandon all the tariffs that they introduced on the behest of the United States, because the United States, especially under Biden, have been pushing the Europeans to impose particular tariffs, for instance, on solar panels. What is the point of putting, tariffs, European tariffs on Chinese solar panels when in Europe we no longer produce solar panels? We need solar panels for the green transition, and we did it only because the Americans asked us to. And now the Americans play hardball with us. Why should we continue to play the American game against China when it comes to solar panels? That's one example. Secondly, we should have not only a trade deal with China, but we should also have what we had in April 2009 at a global level in London, when Gordon Brown brought the G20 together and organized a coordinated reflation of the world economy after the 2008 collapse. Now, Europe and China are facing the backdraft, the recessionary waves that are coming from the United States as a result of the uncertainty, the result of the tariffs and so on. We have a common interest with China for the European Central Bank, the Chinese Central Bank, for instance, to coordinate their policy in order to reflate both the Chinese and the European economy. Okay, we're not doing any of this. And I just honestly lose the will to live when I hear European great leaders, the kind of conversations that they have with one another. They discovered suddenly rearmament as military Keynesianism as the way out of this, which is absurd. It is absolutely absurd. It will have no effect, macroeconomically speaking, that lasts for more than 2-3 years. It doesn't reorient Europe. So, Freddie, yes, Europe could do the right thing by itself, but I don't see the political structures that can produce. Once upon a time, we had a leader in Europe. I didn't like her very much, as Wolfgang knows. Her name was Angela Merkel. But she had the political capital to give a speech of hope for Europe, let's say, if she wanted to, and to consolidate, to bring us all together. Now we don't have that. The Franco-German axis is kaput. It's finished. You can see that we have very weak leaders. Friedrich Merz, we had black smoke just like the Pope in the first vote in the Bundestag. We have lame duck Macron president. Even if they go together, now, when I was in government, there was a north-south divide. Now we have an east-west divide. Whatever the Franco-German axis say regarding Ukraine, regarding China, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia are going to veto it. So I hope you turn out to be correct.
Wolfgang, I'm going to give you the final word. Yeah, we've run out of time. So, Wolfgang, if there's any optimism left in the bucket, please find it.
Look, we've been, the reason, Yanis was talking about Eurobonds. We used to favor this. We gave up because what's the point? What's the point? I mean, the people, it's just, if there is no willingness to create a European Union, sort of a small federal union, and there isn't. It's now getting politically more difficult. Even the Commission and the European Parliament no longer want it. So there isn't any more sort of, why advocate things that nobody wants anymore? And it's really, there was a certain push for this in the 10 years ago. We've moved really backwards. And, unless this changes, I will not rule out that it could change, but I don't see this on the horizon. So the EU has no plan. The EU has no plan to deal with Trump. The EU has no plan to deal with China. It has no plan to, at the moment, it's all about Ukraine. If you just listen to Ursula von der Leyen, she talks about the big idea is to fight a war with Russia. That's the big idea that the EU has. Why should I be hopeful that there's going to be an intelligent, strategic response to this incredibly difficult challenge that we're facing from China, the United States, Russia too, and follow our interests. We haven't done this. I don't see anyone who advocates this. So no, I think the EU will get squashed, and as you said, Hungary will go that way, and France, depends on who leads it, will go this way, and Italy will whatever Italy does.
My friends, we have run out of time. I feel like there will be people across Europe who might have been feeling a little bit more optimistic today or Friday by the time this maybe goes out. They might have thought, Trump is doing these trade deals. The whole thing was a bit of a bluff. Things are going to get back to normal soon. The world will continue spinning on its axis. Well, any such optimism you two have fully destroyed over the last 60 minutes. We're not in the optimism business at UnHerd anyway. We want the truth.
Optimism is the hope of the idiot.
There we go. Yanis Varoufakis and Wolfgang Münchau, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Well, if ever the idea that old-fashioned ideas of political left and right are less relevant than they used to be, I think that conversation pretty much proved it. Wolfgang Münchau, someone considered as part of the centre-right. Yanis Varoufakis, certainly someone who is considered part of the left, but none of that mattered because they were agreeing on a whole load of issues, right? From the wisdom of the Trump administration, at least in its identification of the problem, they both rejected the way he's going about dealing with it, right up to the complete inadequacy of the European institutions to respond to this challenge. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. In fact, I've made them promise that they will both come back. So we will be having further conversations with Yanis and with Wolfgang on what this new world order is all going to be about. A reminder, if you haven't already, to subscribe. Go to unherd.com and you will get lots of wonderful, very inexpensive offers to subscribe. That way you can get all of our articles, the daily email, all of our interviews and videos and the rest of it. Lots of things that are not available on this channel. Do check it out. In the meantime, thanks for joining.